Hello and welcome to this video where we will be taking a look at another game by Gukesh. This game was played when Gukesh was 11 years old and he had the, let's call it, modest rating of 2360. Now, it's up to you to decide whether to call this a modest rating for an 11-year-old, but he was a promising young player at that time. And the game I'm about to show you is actually was actually played at the very famous open tournament in Cappelle-la-Grande in France. I happen to know about this tournament, having played it twice, and it was a one-of-a-kind tournament which attracted players from all over the world. Often there would be more than 500 participants in the tournament. And the tournament was especially attractive to norm seekers because there would be a lot of grandmasters and international masters title players who would get conditions, which would mean they would have their hotel and meals covered. The grandmasters would also have appearance fees, so they would all come and play. And this was a good opportunity for norm seekers to come and hopefully play well and achieve their norms. For example, when I played on one occasion, I was very close to making a grandmaster norm. Therefore, it's not a surprise that Gukesh actually played this tournament in the year 2018. And the game that we are going to take a look at was played against a very strong Spanish Grandmaster, Jaime Santos Latasa, who at the time was rated 2549. Nowadays, Santos is a very well established player of 2650 or more, well, depending on fluctuations. So, in this game, Gukesh, playing white, played the move knight f3, starting the game with knight f3, g6, g3, bishop g7, d4. And perhaps we can understand Latasa playing a kid with a FIDE master rating, and obviously he was trying to win the game with the black pieces. So in this position, he chose the move c5, which is an introduction, more like an invitation for white to perhaps go d5 and give the game a sharper character. However, Gukesh in the game played the move c3, and already you could say it's a restrained approach because it's not the most ambitious move. Nevertheless, this does not mean that Gukesh was not trying to play for win himself. So after c takes d4, c takes d4, d5, we have a symmetrical position on the board, symmetrical pawn structure, and a lot of players, when they see symmetrical pawn structures, they get easily bored and they lose interest in the game. But this is very wrong, and hopefully after seeing this game you will also agree that there is actually a lot of happening under the surface in these positions that can happen in the symmetrical pawn structures. So bishop g2, knight c6, knight c3, and now black has a choice. He can continue with the symmetry with a move like knight f6, when in fact we have a variation of the Grunfeld defense, the Fianchetto line, the so-called neo-Grunfeld. And here white usually seeks to obtain some sort of advantage thanks to having the extra tempo by the move knight e5. However, in the game, Santos played the move e6, and the idea of the move is to develop the knight to e7 rather than on f6. So you could see the more experienced player seeking to disrupt the symmetry in the position. Now castles, knight g7 and e3. It is possible to develop the bishop to f4, but Gukesh prefers to keep it solid, and his plan is actually to go b3 and bishop a3 to develop the bishop on the a3 f8 diagonal. After short castle b3, white follows the plan, but so does black, because b6 and bishop a6 is also the plan for development of the black light squared bishop. So now Gukesh plays the move queen d2. And the idea behind the move is that after bishop a6, the queen attacking the rook on f1, the queen actually liberated the d1 square for the rook. So now the rook is on the d file. Yeah. Queen d7, black develops in the same, in a way, symmetrical manner. Bishop a3 by white, activating the bishop on the a3 f8 diagonal. And now the first interesting moment in the game comes. You could say, okay, both sides finish development. The position is almost completely symmetrical, the difference being with the position of the knights on f3 and e7. But all the other pieces are basically on their corresponding squares. And now, in fact, it was possible for black to play rook fd8, copying white by placing the rook on the d file, and this move would have been quite a good one, because one of white's active ideas in this position, if we go one move back, is the central advance with e4. And you see that the rook on d1 comes quite handy by covering the pawn on d4. So after d takes e4, knight takes e4, the knight can then use the d6 square. So rook fd8 would have been a good prophylactic way, because after e4, d takes e4, the rook, the queen, the knight, and the bishop on g7 would all be attacking the pawn on d4. But in this position, what Santos did was actually to go bishop b7. And it's a bit of a strange move, because the bishop was quite active on a6. And the problem is not only that the bishop is less active now on b7, but also because it gives white access to the b5 square. And from b5, the knight can land on the d6 square. So this becomes an important and interesting motive in some of the lines that we are about to see. Now Gukesh continues with rook ac1, which is completing of the development. The last piece enters the game. But he actually had a very interesting possibility in knight b5 here. So after knight b5, the threat is obviously to land the knight on d6 and perhaps take the bishop on b7 and obtain the advantage of the bishop pair. And after rook fd8, knight d6, we actually are at some sort of a crossroad, because if black is actually very careful here, he would play a move like knight c8, and after knight takes b7, queen takes b7, even though white won the pair of bishops, yeah, it's still the position is quite okay for black, because it's very closed, very solid. Yeah, he has a good bishop, dark squared bishop. The pawns are on light squares, so the bishop is not restricted. So all these factors point out that the knights are quite all right in this position, especially after something like knight d6, and black is extremely solid. However, what I would like to show you is that what could have happened had black been ambitious, and after knight d6, for example, he could play bishop a6 to keep the bishop alive. And all of a sudden now, I also found it very hard to believe that in this dull, sterile position, you can get fireworks that you could not possibly imagine existed. So after rook ac1, knight c8, the idea is to exchange knight for knight, not to give up the bishop on b7 as we saw before. And now in this position, where look at all white's pieces are, except for the knight on d6, they are all pretty far away from black's position. You can see like the knight on f3, queen on d2, rooks are back, the bishops are just okay on squares that do not seem particularly threatening to black's position. And yet in this position, white has an amazing resource here, quite an unexpected one, in the move knight f7. Boom. So the queen cannot take the knight, because then black loses the knight on c6. So king f7 should be played, yeah, and now e4. And like looking at this, you would say, how can white possibly have any compensation here? Like a piece down for a pawn and nothing really happening. So how is this actually working? But the lines are actually very fascinating, and I'll just show you some of them. not going too much into detail. For example, in this position, the only move is the move king g8. Now, you wouldn't imagine, like, black is fine, good solid position, but needs to make an only move in this position to stay in the game. And to illustrate, why not take on e4? d5 is now devastating. And after taking on f3, bishop h3, and all of a sudden everything collapses for black. Everything is hanging, and black loses. So, king g8 is the only move. Now e takes d5, e takes d5, knight e5. Now again, black should take with the bishop, not with the knight. So we'll just continue. Bishop takes e5, d takes e5. Now again, knight 8 e7. Again, the only move to connect the knights and defend this knight on c6. And now another bolt, e6. Sacrificing the pawn in order to open the e-file. Queen takes e6, rook e1, queen d7, and queen g5. So white is a clear piece down, no pawns whatsoever, but the compensation is fantastic. It's just unbelievable. I'll just show you a few more moves. Rook ac8, and now h4. Simply intending h5. Just a clear piece down, playing for positional compensation, and white has excellent compensation. In fact, black needs to play very, very, very precisely from this position to get to an endgame which is somewhat worse for him. So amazing stuff. You wouldn't believe it, you know, looking at the position at the, again, I will ironically say dull and boring position with this sterile pawn structure that we have on the board. So in this position, knight f7, it's just unbelievable. But that did not happen because Gukesh, instead of knight b5, went rook ac1, and now both sides just continued to develop their pieces. Rook fd8. But now, in fact, Gukesh continued with the plan of improving his position by doubling the rooks on the c file. But in fact, knight b5 was worth some attention. Not so, okay, part of the idea is to land the knight on d6, but another part of the idea of planting a knight on b5 is a provocative nature, because what white wants is for black to play a6. Now, to show you why, let's say knight f5, stopping knight d6 by controlling the square, g4, attacking the knight, yeah, a6, a counter attack. So the knight drops back to c3, the knight drops back to d6, and now knight a4. And this is the idea of provoking a6. Black weakened the b6 pawn. And this gives white some initiative, because this is not so easy and straightforward to defend. If black needs to go knight c8, then the coordination between the rooks is disrupted, so black experiences some discomfort in the position. And this idea of putting a piece on b5 and provoking a6 will feature also later in the game. But Gukesh went rook c2, black went knight f5, rook dc1, rook ac8, and now a second interesting, important moment in this game, when you could again say that the position is again sterile, boring, nothing is happening, and so forth. Objectively, the position is equal, but white, it's not only black who needs to be careful, for example, after those knight b5 ideas, but also white needs to be careful a little bit. And in this position, Gukesh actually wasn't careful. A neutral move would have been a move like h4, for example, yeah, introducing perhaps some h5 ideas, and if black plays h5, then white gets the g5 square, perhaps for a knight, and so forth. So the maneuvering would have continued. But Gukesh played the move knight e1. I would imagine the idea is twofold. One is to put the knight on d3, and the other one is to perhaps allow for some f4 expansion by, and then there would be better control over the central e5 square. But this allowed a tactical chance to black that, as it happened, both players missed. So, black played the move here, bishop h6, which is a rather primitive move if you look at it, because it pins the pawn on e3 and threatens to take the pawn on d4. Yeah, but white defends fairly straightforwardly against it. But what happened, in fact, was that after knight e1, black had a tactical shot, and like I said, it was missed, and that shot was taking on d4 with either knight. So knight takes d4, e d4, knight d4. Now the rook on c2 is hanging, rook b2, and now bam, rook takes c3. So double sacrifice, but after rook c3, knight b5, the position of the white pieces is really somewhat comical. Yeah, they're all exposed along the dark squares. And after rook bishop b4, escaping the attack, a5, the bishop has nowhere to go because if just it's basically trapped. Yeah, so bishop takes a5, b takes a5. Now the rook is hanging on c3, so it must run away. Rook c5, take on b2, queen b2, and something like, let's say, rook c8. Black is a clear pawn up, and likely with the excellent winning chances. So this was a great chance that Black had in the game to turn the game in his favor and punish White for missing this tactical shot. But as we will see, as we saw after knight e1, Black played bishop h6, missing the chance, the only chance he had in this game, and after f4, expanding, the game goes back to the maneuvering phase with an approximately equal position. So after f4, the bishop is pretty useless on h6. So Black went back to g7, even though it was possible to go to f8 and exchange this active bishop that White has on a3. Black will come to this idea later on, but as the position is closed, things are developing slowly now. The loss of tempo doesn't really affect Black much. So knight f3, coming back to f3 with the knight, perhaps intending to land on the e5 square. h5, this stops possible expansion with g4. Bishop f1. So Gukesh is activating the light squared bishop. And again, if you remember what I mentioned before, putting a piece on b5 is an important idea. Not only just pinning the knight on c6, maybe threatening knight e5, but also by with the idea of to provoke a6 and weaken the pawn on b6. So queen e8. It was possible, of course, to play a move like knight d6 to stop, let's say, bishop b5, or again bishop f8. Yeah, to exchange the dark squared bishops, but for the time being, nothing wrong with queen e8. Though now White gets to play the move bishop b5, pinning this knight on c6 and provoking a6. So in this position, for example, if Black goes a6, after the bishop will drop back to f1, and then knight a4 will be the idea to attack the pawn on b6. And if Black prevents it by playing b5, there is knight d1, and now the c5 square has been weakened. So, for example, a possible idea is, let's say, knight b2, knight d3, and then landing a knight on c5. So, after bishop b5, Black played the move bishop f8. The bishops were exchanged on f8, and now Gukesh plays a move that's I like, because it just shows clarity in his thinking, and by taking the knight on c6. So the idea is to eliminate as many pieces as possible and leave Black with a relatively passive, and you could say even bad, light squared bishop, because the majority of Black's pawns are on light squares. So this bishop is quite limited in its movement. So bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, and now queen f2. The idea of queen f2 is to defend the pawn on g3 so that h3 and g4 is allowed to happen. So White wants to expand on the king side. So king g7 by Black, h3, intending g4, knight d6, getting away from the attack, g4, hg4, hg4, and now we arrive, in fact, at the critical moment in the game where Black makes the decisive mistake. And the reason for this mistake is that Black simply either underestimated or overlooked White's threat. And White's threat in this position is, in fact, to start attack on the h-file with moves like rook, queen h4 and rook h2. That means that Black's best move was to go queen e7 to stop queen h4 by controlling that square and allowing perhaps for rook h8. let's say g5, still maybe going queen h4 and rook h2, but now rook h8, and the position remains balanced. Let's say knight e5, bishop b7, yes, the bishop is passive, the knight is great on e5, but black doesn't really have weaknesses, everything is well defended, and the maneuvering would have continued. However, black had this unfortunate idea to activate the bad bishop by putting it on b5, but this was really an unfortunate decision because the bishop lands on a square where it can be taken, and all sorts of tactics can happen, as we shall see. Because after taking on b5, the c file is open, the rook on c8 can hang, and this will work in white's favor. So Gukesh went queen h4, and now objectively white is winning. The threats is rook h2, but also knight g5 or knight e5, and so forth. Black played queen d7 to allow for rook h8. Just to show you that queen h8 would not have helped black, because after the exchange of queens, queen h8, let's say king h8, knight takes b5. Now knight b5 is not possible because the rook on c8 is lost, so rook c2 first, rook c2, knight b5, knight e5, centralizing the knight, targeting the pawn on f7, king g7, a4, attacking the knight so that the rook can land on the 7th rank, knight d6, and rook c7. So, and this is a technically winning position for white, because black can barely move. So he's tied down to the defense of the f7 pawn, a7 is hanging, white controls the open c file, and black is basically technically lost. So black avoided this by playing queen d7, but now knight e5 with tempo, attacking the queen, queen b7, and the decisive breakthrough f5. There was an alternative win with knight takes b5, knight takes b5, and now the tactical shot knight takes f7. It's not possible to take with the king because queen h7 check would win the queen on b7, and the knight on f7 cannot be taken with the queen because the rook on c8 is hanging, therefore black should take on c2, but after rook c2 now the problem is that the rook on d8 is hanging. So if black takes the knight, then white wins the rook on d8 with a winning position. So this was an alternative win, but Gukesh's move wins just as well. He played f5, e takes f5, now knight b5 first, knight takes b5, and g takes f5. The problem is that the winning threat is f6 with mating threats against the king. So black took on c2, and now the important move, f6 check first, king g8, and now Gukesh chose the sadistic way to force resignation by simply taking the rook on c2 when there is no defense against queen h6, queen g7, or rook h2 and mating along the h file. Just to show you that he could have, if he wanted, to play with a bit more flair by going queen h6, sacrificing the rook on c1, but mate is inevitable. King f2, let's say, rook c2, king g3, and mate comes to g7, let's say rook g2, king g2, and white wins. So again, I would say a very impressive game by Gukesh, age of 11, beating a very strong grandmaster in a manner that's a combination of positional maneuvering, and then when the chance appeared, with a very strong tactical acumen and execution, ending in checkmate. So I hope you enjoyed this video, showing you the strength that the 11-year-old Gukesh had at that time, and I then surely invite you to check the next one as we continue our journey by exploring Gukesh's games at various stages of his career.